Hi, I'm Liz Randolph, Director of Alumni and Alumni Communications at Vassar. Thank you so much for joining us for this, the third From the Pub event, this time entitled Friendship and Intimacy in the Millennial Age. Today we present Michael Kimmel, whose research is shedding new light on men and masculinity, and Rachel Simmons, whose best-selling book illuminates the struggles and concerns of girls and young women, especially as they navigate relationships with each other. Please welcome Rachel Simmons and Michael Kimmel.
Thank you. It's a thrill for me to be here, to be back at Vassar, and also to be with you, Rachel, because I've always admired your work so much, and also admired and love being friends with you and neighbors. So let me start off a little bit by asking you something about your work. In your book Odd Girl Out, you talk about an epidemic of inauthenticity among girls. They're seeking to avoid relational aggression and group aggression by basically swallowing conflict instead of addressing it. It's part of that cult that you end up calling the good girl, the cult of the good girl. Tell us more about that inauthenticity.
It's amazing how girls from really young ages develop this sense that I have to be liked by everyone, I have to be nice to everyone, I have to give to others instead of thinking about what I need for myself. I have to meet someone and just get them to like me before I even decide whether or not I want to be friends with them. These are lessons that girls internalize in girlhood through a host of media. And what happens is, at the same time, they're developing these incredibly intimate friendships. They love their friends. They lavish enormous time internally in their own minds and also externally, even the number of words that they speak to their friends, which tends to be more than the number of words that boys will speak to their friends. I mean, they're just with their friends. They love them. So it's like, be nice all the time, but have these really close friendships in which I sometimes get mad. So what do I do when I'm supposed to be liked by everyone, but you keep bossing me around and telling me what you want me to do and not giving me a choice? So what happens is girls often take their real feelings underground. And as they get older, they take them to their other friends. They gossip. They take them online through text messaging. They take them everywhere but to the person who is bothering them. And that creates a kind of beneath the radar aggression. But what it also creates is the foundation for a problem in women's leadership. Right. Because the girls who don't learn how to talk to their friends become the women who can't assert themselves out in any sector of their life.
It's really interesting. There's a parallel phenomenon among with boys. Some of the research on boys used to say that boys didn't have, from earliest age, from whatever age 3, we were so busy playing with trains and dressing up like police officers that we never had developed the kind of friendships that girls developed. But the research on boys' friendships now suggests that as little boys, they have very deep and very meaningful and very emotionally rich friendships to which they can actually give voice. They will talk about this. My own son, for example, when he was in 6th grade, the boys would sign each other's yearbooks. I heart you, Zach. Love, Jack. And they were standing with their arms around each other all the time. They have a rich language. And sometime around 12 or 13, it shuts down. And the research, and so the good research on boys' friendships now talks about that shutting down. They know they've lost something. Because when they're asked at 14 and 15, do you have any really close friends? They have bros, they have homies, they have their guys, but they don't have any real friends. And they can actually talk at 14 or 15 with a kind of nostalgic longing. Oh, I used to have a friend like that, but I don't anymore. And that sets a track for men's friendships that's actually quite different than the track for women's friendships.
Yeah, and I think actually my work started out being so much about how girls engage in relational aggression, how girls go behind each other's backs. But it's become clear that around adolescence, boys start doing a lot of the same things, that boys are engaging in relational aggression. Boys are ganging up and psychologically excluding or isolating another boy. So actually, it seems like there are many more similarities emerging between girls and boys, aggression patterns, certainly in middle and high school, than we previously thought. And I think one of the most exciting parts about working in this field is kind of learning and realizing that some of the assumptions we held weren't true. Can you talk a little bit more, Michael, about some of the masculine codes or the codes of masculinity that set in around 12 or 13? Why are we now going into sort of the bro world as opposed to the dear Zach, I love you, love Jack?
Yeah, there's a line in a Yeats poem that he ruffles in a manly pose for all his timid heart. And I think what happens to boys is that they learn that the guy code is you have to be impenetrable, impervious, completely stoic, hard, and that model of masculinity is what's going to travel with you. So in order to never be vulnerable, to never show anything, you suppress all of those emotional needs, which we will later then put on your head. Thank you very much. You'll take care of all of those for us. And so what happens to boys is they have to develop some connections. They do in high school and college. They develop the brotherhood. And the brotherhood demands certain kinds of masculine postures for them, certain performances. But underneath, they know that a lot of that is inauthentic. It's just posing for other guys. Guys are unbelievably, relentlessly policed by other guys. Some of the men who are sitting in this audience will know what I'm talking about. But I remember in my own middle school, we would sneak up behind a guy and we would say, because that your instinctive reaction reveals something deep and true about you. So we would sneak up behind a guy and go, look at your fingernails, right? And if you looked at his fingernails like this, it was okay. And if you looked at him like this, you could beat him up legitimately because obviously he was a girl. So that idea that you are constantly being policed by other guys about how you walked, how you talked, how you moved, how you interacted, how you looked at your fingernails, how you crossed your legs. Everything was somehow an indicator of your inner masculinity. So this is what puts guys in this kind of really tight straitjacket that I end up calling the guy code, or that Bill Pollack calls the boy code.
Increasingly, it seems like so much of the public conversation about gender is really focusing on white girls and boys. Certainly the dominant conversation that makes it on the Today Show.
Yeah.
And this is really troubling to me, especially because, as you're pointing out, minority communities often espouse really different and hopeful and exciting modes of connection, of communication. And so in my world, I think, the real example is African American girls and women who in many ways really actively try to undermine that curse of the good girl, as I call it. In African American communities, they're traditional ones, there's a real appreciation for the assertiveness of women and girls. And moreover, African American moms really take steps to prepare their daughters to go into a world where they will have to kind of protect themselves, which is a real contrast to Caucasian girls who are told to be friends with everyone. And so what happens is the measures of self-esteem loss in adolescent girls are not nearly as radical for African American girls as they are for white girls. And yet, what do we see? When Black girls are assertive, particularly in white environments, they are pathologized as being too loud. And when you actually talk to these girls, they say, but I'm just being honest. I'm just telling you what I think. But there's not real support for that. So I think one of the problems in this kind of conversation about relationship and connection among boys and girls is who we're talking about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that, it's a sociological axiom that the movements or impulses for social change move from the margin to the center. So that's really where you're going to see that creativity, because people have to deal with the way these ideas are being used against them. So they have to come up with some pretty creative ways to survive that. The other thing I was going to say, and I think this is really important because it's a place where our work intersects, is the other thing that, when you say, is it harder for boys? I mean, it's easier for girls, that's all in air quotes. It's easier for girls thanks to feminism. When I started my teaching, 25 years ago, I would ask my students, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Now, if I were to say to my female students, what does it mean to be a woman? You know what they'd say? Anything I want.
Girls say, I can be anything, but as my friend and your friend Courtney Martin says, they interpret that as I have to be everything.
Right.
And that's part of the problem. And Deborah Spar, the president of Barnard, who has a new book out called Wonder Women, which is trying to interrogate this culture of perfectionism among young women and grown women, is saying that feminism really privatized sort of the sense of what it means to be a woman, so that women interpreted feminism as, okay, now I've got to try to be everything all the time and perfect at it. One of the areas where I see so much of this happening is in social media, where I think the pressure that is on girls and young women to use social media as a way to project this persona of like, I am doing it all and having it all in my relationships and in my life has become increasingly oppressive. I interact a lot with young women, and the number of social media sites that they are visiting constantly on their phones, whether it's Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter and Facebook and texting and iChats, big group chats, and email, if they're even on email anymore, rarely they are, is
so slow.
It's exhausting, right? It's so slow, and it's exhausting. It's actually exhausting. It's a kind of social work. That young women have to engage in. I just wonder, do you see the same with guys?
That's really, I'm going to say one thing off of that, which is, for years, one of the things that happened to men's and women's friendships with each other, men's friendships with other men, women's friendships with other women, is that they diverged through adulthood. Because women did the business of friendship. They're the ones who wrote the thank you notes, remembered other people's birthdays, made the plans to get together with
the
friends.
thank you notes.
Right, so women did the business of friendship while men, and so women's friendships tended to be, historically, through adulthood, existential, which is you make a friend in high school or even elementary school or certainly in college, and you carry those friends with you. So virtually all of my female friends will tell me they have a really close friend from high school and from college. But virtually none of my male friends, my male friends had fraternity brothers. They had bros, they had guys. But men's friendships tend to be episodic. I make really good friends with the guys at work, and we see each other all the time. And then when I change jobs, or they move or something, we never see each other again.
Yeah, but if you saw the guys that you were friends with 10 years ago, you would probably be like, what's up? And hang out, and it'd be cool. If it was a woman, she'd be like, why haven't you emailed me?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I haven't heard from you in a while.
That's true.
There would be a whole thing.
But here's what happens. This is the traditional model, and it was absolutely true in my own family, that by their age 40 or 50, most men's friends are the husbands of their wives' friends. And their wives' friends are their friends from like college days. And so my father, basically, his friendship network completely changed, and his closest friends were the husbands of my mom's friends. And so when they divorced, he had no friends anymore because they all disappeared. So that idea of the sort of episodic versus existential friendship has been, not necessarily any longer, but has been the model for the difference between adult men and adult women's friendship, because women did all of that stuff. And my guess is, from what you're saying, they're still doing it.
I think so.
All of this new social media is basically a way to sustain relationships.
I feel like with women and girls, we constantly have to be reassuring each other that the friendship is still there.
Right.
And there's a sense that quantity is quality.
Right.
And so this is why social media has made friendship so challenging in some ways, because I recently heard, I don't know if this is true, but that the average response to a text is 15 minutes or less, that people feel that they have to respond really quickly to a text. And I know, just for example, with my the Girls Leadership Institute, which I co-founded, it has a summer camp program, and we don't let the girls have their cell phones because we want them to talk to each other. Right. And periodically we give them their phones back. And I can't tell you how many of these girls turn on their phones to a slew of messages from other girls being like, why aren't you writing me back? What's going on? Are you mad at me? So the other person interprets that as, oh my God, this relationship is in trouble.
Right.
So partly what I wonder is there a burden of communication now that has really fallen somewhat disproportionately on the shoulders of young women? Again, not just to project this persona on Facebook, on Instagram of like, look how great I look and look how many friends I have and look at my amazing playlist on Spotify, right. Which is now becoming the new thing, like look how hip my music is. But also, this need, this urgency about how to stay connected with each other. And I just wonder how much time that's taking up.
I think you're right. I think that what is happening and this is going to keep young women so preoccupied with the maintenance of all of these friendships, which is now needing to be maintained every 15 minutes, as opposed to getting on with their lives. It's, and which is to say, actually reading a book, studying, doing their professional
it's like
life.
It didn't happen if I didn't Instagram it.
I mean, I keep thinking, well, it'll reach its natural limits, but then, of course, that lasted 10 minutes.
Yes, yeah. So
that's interesting. I think that the pressure. You're exactly right about guys. We 2 months will go by. We don't talk to each other. We'll see each other. Go, oh yeah, no, I was pissed at you about that, but it's over now. Okay, it's all good.
That would never happen for me in my world. Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just want to change start moving us more into talking about intimacy between young men and young women and in the millennial age. And in your book, Guyland, The Perilous World Where Boys Become Men, you talk about a separate stage of development that's emerging among young men who are delaying the traditional markers of adulthood. And one of those markers is marriage and serious relationships. Right. So you argue that young men seem to be avoiding these as long as possible. So can you talk a little bit about why, and maybe we can put our heads together about what's going on with women too?
Yeah. First of all, I think this is a demographic trend, and it's true for both women and men. The average age of marriage in 1950 was 20.4, and now it's 28.3. I mean, people are spending a full decade longer in reaching the 5 demographic markers of adulthood, which is you get married, you finish your education, you get a job, you have a kid, and you move out of your parents' house. Mm-hmm. And when you finish all 5 of those, you are, by the demographer's standards, a grown-up. And most people will finish those by 31 or 32. But what's interesting to me is that this is, so I don't think that guys are delaying in that sense, because frankly, if we could, we would be delaying until our 40s. But women won't let us. So I think that the question is really that as a generation, there is now a generational stage of development in between adolescence and adulthood. And some people call it adultolescence, some people call it emerging adulthood, and I call it Guyland because I think it's characterized by remarkable amounts of gender inequality. And so that's what I was setting out to try to talk about, the ways in which guys are asked in this stage of development, after you leave high school, after you've been so dramatically overparented, before you become a grown-up, what happens in this space to young guys where they're constantly being asked to prove their masculinity to each other. And so the book basically chronicles, it's sort of a checklist of all the things that happen on campuses: binge drinking, hooking up, hazing, sports, video games, fantasy football. I mean, it's all of that kind of the world of guys and why guys are so desperate to prove themselves. So I don't see this as about a Peter Pan syndrome. I see it more as a Peter Panic syndrome. Guys who are desperate to prove their masculinity. And the problem is you have 17-year-olds proving it to 18-year-olds. Mm-hmm. And that can't work. So it's a generational thing. It's true for women too. Women are delaying. I mean, my female students can tell you how old they'll be when they have their first kid, right? 25 years ago when I started my research, I would ask my students, like, how do you plan to balance work and family? When you're out of school. And my women students 25 years ago would say, oh, we're going to love each other. It's going to work out. And the male students said, huh? Now the women say, well, first, I'm going to get my career going. But when I'm 27 or 28, that's when I'm start looking for a relationship. Because I really want to have my first kid when I'm like 28 or 29. But then I'm not going to take any time off. Then when I have my second kid at 31, that's when I'm going to take 5 years off. So I really want to be around when my kids are developing. But I won't lose anything in my career by then, they believe.
Ha.
Right. The guys, you know what the guys say now? We're going to love each other. It's going to work out. Mm-hmm. So the men basically are where the women were 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. So this idea that my students can tell you how old they'll be, this is true for women too. They are planning quite differently in terms of this trajectory because they know that a relationship and children has the potential to derail their career and work-life ambitions.
Mm-hmm. It seems that on the surface of it, young women want to delay things like marriage and childbearing for sure, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they also want to delay meaningful relationship.
Right.
And I think that piece is sort of what many young women are struggling with right now, particularly in college, which is that, and it is perhaps the male desire to prove their masculinity that has characterized the hookup culture, right? Mm-hmm. So that men feel that they have to have conquests, or that that part of being appropriately masculine is not being a sissy in a relationship who's being whipped, but actually somebody who gets around and is a player. That most of the real research on this is finding a deep level of dissatisfaction.
Right. I agree with you entirely. I think that people use hooking up as sort of the the standard mode of socio-sexual relationships on campuses, for example, differently. That women still, and I'll tell you how we know this, because the data on this is women are the ones who initiate what they call the DTR, define the relationship. Most campuses, they call it the talk, right? So after you've hooked up a couple of times, you have to have a conversation like, okay, what are we? Are we like dating? Are we like a couple? That's almost always the women who initiate that. So clearly their idea of hooking up is in the service of seeing if you want to actually have a relationship or not. Whereas the guys, hooking up is the end in and of itself, and they try to avoid that conversation.
I also think, though, that women are hooking up not just to see if a guy wants a relationship, but because they think that's the only avenue available to them. But I guess what I wonder is why is it not okay for women to say, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore? Right. And I think part of it is a performance for other girls and other women. So I think
how liberated they are.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's about proving that I'm a badass, and that I'm really, I can roll like that, and I'm one of the guys. And going back to sort of our original, what I said at the very beginning of this conversation, there's this real depression in young women of what they really think and feel and want, right. and a real disconnection from that. And I think we see that manifesting in a very disturbing way, and at great contrast to the accomplishments of young women. You can see sparklingly successful young women who have these incredible resumes. But you also will see them engage in all kinds of things at night when they're quote unquote off duty. Right. But are they really off duty? So,
I've noticed this consistently. This question of people sort of having a day and a night behavior. And I also agree with you. I think that this is complicated. And I think that neither of the polar positions, that women do not like pleasure seeking for its own sake and they don't want to hook up, we know that that's surely wrong. Just as we also know it's surely wrong that all women want to have him commit completely emotionally before they'll take their clothes off. We know that those poles are wrong, but we don't know how to talk about this middle part. One of the biggest changes in my estimation among young people now from when I was a student here is cross-sex friendships. It is the single biggest change among young people that I've noticed. 25 years ago, I would ask my students, how many of you have a good friend of the opposite sex? I'd maybe get 10% hands. Now I ask, is there anyone in here who doesn't have a good friend of the opposite sex? Never see a hand, or almost never. Personally, I'm from the Harry met Sally generation. Men and women can't be friends because sex always gets in the way. So what do you think's going on that allows these cross-sex friendships? Is it that men are becoming such wimps that they're more like women? Or is it women are becoming more masculinized, that they're more like guys? That everybody's basically a guy? What's facilitating?
Okay, so I think the idea of like everyone's basically a guy, in a way, to the extent that being a guy means having a lot of freedom to define yourself however you want to define yourself. So I think back in the day, a woman had very limited prescribed roles, and she kind of course she could work, but really the pressure to get the MRS degree and find a partner closer to the time of college graduation and settle down and define yourself as a mother, really probably more than anything, that was really salient. And so those interactions, the pressure to try to find a spouse, that made the interactions very loaded. Now, as we've just discussed, the delaying of these rites of passage, of parenting, of marriage, frees you up to look at another individual just as he or she is. So I think everyone's more like a guy. There's more respect that men have for women. There's more respect that women have for men. I think that pressure really existed before, and it doesn't so much now.
I think that I'm very optimistic about this cross-sex friendships, because I think what happens is that young people leave college and go into the work world with the actual experience of greater gender equality in their relationships than any generation ever. Think what this is going to do in the workplace. It means we're going to be able to be, sexual harassment will decline because we know how to be colleagues with each other. We actually know how to work on projects together.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I would also add that sexual harassment continues to be like an epidemic issue. So I think it's just like, I wouldn't want to like, I think you're right. We're both right. Like, that sexual harassment is still a problem.
In the long
and
term.
In the long term, we're
Right.
going to see a real change around that as a result. And I think your contribution to the cross-sex friendship discussion has always been something that I've really enjoyed. And not a lot of people talk about it. So
Yeah.
it's great that that you
I
are.
think, as an educator, I've always been very optimistic because temperamentally, I think we believe that people's lives will be better if they can critically engage with their world. But this is the thing that I think makes me most optimistic, because as I observe it, although all of these problems, of course, still exist, women and men have never been more equal than they are in the United States today. It is also true that we are not there yet. I hasten to say, but think about. I mean, there are still. I mean, sitting here at Vassar with you is so special for me, because in the library here at Alumni House there's a portrait of Henry Noble McCracken, who was president here in the teens. He used to charter a train at his own expense to take Vassar women into New York to march in the great suffrage parades. I mean, there are still people who are still alive today when women couldn't vote, when women couldn't serve on juries, couldn't drive cars, couldn't open a checking account in their own name without their husband's permission, their husband's as a co-signer. So we've never been more equal, and this notion of friendship in our personal relationship makes me real optimistic about the long-term future. Not to gainsay any of the problems that still exist.
Well, I guess I would wrap it up by saying that what's most hopeful for me is that now that so much of feminism's structural and policy work, I wouldn't say is done, but so much work has been done, we're having more time to turn our attention to the internal lives of girls and young women.
Yeah.
Even the controversial work of Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, which many feminists rightly charge does not hold the structures and the institutions accountable enough, and instead puts the onus on women to lean in and advocate for themselves. That's actually a really important watershed in feminism, because it means that we're actually going to be able to start helping young women and girls develop the skills that they need in order to stay connected to themselves, in order to say, I don't like this relationship as it is, I want to change it. Or to be able to say, you know what, I don't really like communicating constantly on social media. I'm going to put it aside for a while and do something different. So to me, that focus on the inner resume, as I call it, is really the most hopeful change that I see coming.
That's good. That's good.
So thank you, Michael,
Yeah,
for
thank
this
you,
amazing
Rachel. This is
conversation. I
great.
have to give you a hug. And,
That's great.
and it's really been a pleasure.
Yeah, well, for me too. Thank you.
Well, we are excited to open the floor to questions, and we'd love to hear from you about some of the things that you've heard us talk about or questions that you have.
I read an article that said that people, of our generation who are engaging in any kind of romantic or sexual relationships, that now everything has become a relationship because of social media and because we can constantly track, look at them on Facebook and look at their previous relationships, and after, it's no longer an ex-boyfriend because, I can just constantly keep in contact with him via email, and that makes it easier to keep in touch. And I just was wondering if you guys could speak to this idea that intimacy has been changed by the fact that there isn't really such a thing as a one-night stand anymore, and that, we're constantly reaching out to each other more easily now because we don't have to do it face-to-face.
That's a great question. It's like, I think there are two different ways to look at that. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, there's something really magical about being able to email someone from your past and say, how are you? Because I saw you on Facebook, and what's going on? And let's reconnect, which can bring its own kind of joys and challenges. But there's also something that's happening that might be more pernicious, which is a change in the definition of relationship itself. And that, in fact, all of this work that I see young women doing in the service of their relationships doesn't necessarily correlate to high-quality relationships. It has diluted, I think, the more satisfying, meaningful, deep aspects of relationship that we typically and continue to only find in person contact, in person-to-person contact. So I think that it's a mixed bag. I think it would be problematic for me to call continuing to stay in touch with an ex not really an ex, because it's not a real relationship once you're no longer together. If we see it as one, then what is relationship, right? If nothing is if everything is a relationship, then nothing is a relationship.
I think, as Rachel, I rarely think that these are either or propositions. Either we're becoming, either we're bowling alone or we're friending everybody in sight. I think it's both and, as Rachel says. And I think that in cases of increased intimacy, being able to sustain connection over longer periods of time, larger geographic distances, I think this does change the nature of our relationships. I do think that. But I also think it's far less intimate to get broken up with when someone changes their Facebook status. So those are less intimate ways of doing things. And you watch, kids are sort of trying to figure out, well, how do I end this relationship? Do I text? Do I email? Do I do something as antediluvian as make a telephone call, talk to someone in person? I mean, all of these are different levels of intimacy as we experience them. So I think it's both. I think that we have that this allows for greater intimacy and greater continuity of relationships. But I also think that there are ways in which it may inhibit the kind of long-term face-to-face conversations. You know how imprecise and imperfect email is. You can't really monitor tones of voice, which is why we have an array of thousands of emoticons. You can't really modulate. You can't really watch someone's eyes when you say when you tweet something, and so those are some losses as well. So the technology has the capacity to both bring us together and separate us, and it's not either or.
Sherry Turkle from MIT has her most recent book is called Alone Together, which is really about the proliferation of social media and relationships. So I think you might be into that. But I also just want to say, speaking very personally here, I mean, it's I hang out with a lot of young women. Maybe you can tell that. I'm probably really immature on some level, which has enabled me to continue to hang out in this field. So I can kind of imagine what it's like to be 21, 22 years old right now. I'm just saying, I think that there's something really problematic about being able to just take and do with these tools that often ends up giving us kind of situations that we wouldn't normally have if we just had the time to think about it first. Yes.
Yeah. In listening to all your commentary, it seems that there's a continuum. So some of the things we're talking about that maybe are traditionally feminine or masculine, there's sort of an in-between there as well. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, sort of the experiences of people who maybe fall in between sort of these two ends.
We have these ideas that men and women fall into these two categorical containers. Here's the Martians, here's the Venusians. They have nothing to do with each other. They're completely and fundamentally different. And yet our daily experience is that there's a massive continuum, and people fall in different places and on different characteristics, on different traits. Or, some men will cluster here, but there's always this group over here. Some women will cluster here, but there's always some over here. Our experience is so much richer than these two containers could ever possibly encompass. Most of us cluster sort of toward the middle of our of that continuum. There might be some small differences. So the richness of experiences, and I think that this is what we learn in our daily life, is it's about different individuals being composites of these traits and attitudes and behaviors far more than it is that's what men do and that's what women do. At the same time, the ideology that's being imposed on us, coerced into us all the time is that's not manly enough, this is how you have to behave, this is how you have to act. So we're being policed all the time to act in a way that is completely contrary to who we actually think we are. And then you add Rachel's point about the inauthenticity of, in order to do that, you have to suppress all of this. And I think that you have the recipe for a problem in development that has been remedied to a large extent by works like hers, by the feminist movement in general that said to women, you can be a lot more than what this container was telling you that you could be.
I'd make two quick adds. I think gender identity discourse is one of the most wonderful and exciting things to happen, not just to the trans population, but to all of us, because it's given us more permission to talk about ways in which we might deviate from conventional masculinity and femininity. So I find that to be truly like one of the most wonderful developments of the last 25 years. And the other thing is, I would say, like socially, I think there's much more permission for men to act more feminine and women to act more masculine than there is professionally. So I can tell you that like my female heterosexual friends have married, most of them have married like extraordinary men who are masculine in the ways that you write about in the kind of ultimate ideal masculinity,
Right.
whose masculinity is about looking out for others, about protecting, about caring in a particular way. And yet, when I think those same men go into the workplace and try to espouse those same characteristics, they tend to be more punished. Same with women.
Yep.
So that it's totally fine for me to like behave in a masculine way, interpersonally, socially. But as many research studies are now showing us, if I don't smile when I ask you for a raise, or if I don't preface my request for a raise by saying, I hope it's okay that I ask this.
And I
Right.
totally don't deserve it.
Right, and like, so if I don't invoke some conventional femininity before I take my masculine step, then I'm going to be knocked down. So I think that we're seeing progress in different places. Molly.
Speaking of the workplace, I share your optimism and your vision of a better world by and large. But one place where I see a tremendous impediment to the equality that you're mentioning, but also, frankly, just to full human lives for both men and women, is that the inner self is freer. I agree with you, Rachel, on that. The structures of employment are not changing, it seems to me, much at all. And Sheryl Sandberg's book indicates to us that they aren't changing. And I don't think that having women CEOs is going to make them change in a way that is going to let both, if you will, their traditional masculine selves, which are the breadwinners and protectors and providers, and their feminine selves, which are caregivers. I want men and women to have both of those traits all the way up. This society is not permitting that kind of integrated lives. And I don't see much happening in corporate America that will allow that emergence of what I would regard as the really valuable human life.
Right.
What do you think?
I think, for example, affordable childcare and flex time are the single biggest impediments to women's success in a corporate or any other kind of professional environment. So I'm going to say something that comes more out of the work I did with you at Vassar, which is that, I know, don't panic. You don't have to remember anything. I just wonder, I've always thought about this, right? Why hasn't the work of feminism extended to these areas? And I have come to believe that I just don't think that second wave feminism valued motherhood as much as it valued women participating alongside men in the institutions that were excluding them. And I think that I am living, I don't have that problem because I am luckily and for now self-employed, so I can make my own schedule. But I think many of my female colleagues are living the reverberations of those choices that were made. And I don't think that it necessarily, I'm not saying like they were choices that needed to be made. There were institutions excluding women, and yet somewhere along the way, I think motherhood was kind of relegated to the side as something that, like Betty Friedan, she wanted the problem that had no name. She wanted those women to go out and work and go back to school. Sure. She didn't want them to be necessarily happy homemakers. So, I don't, you can respond to that, Michael, you can comment on that, but that's what I have been coming to think about. And I feel like I learned a lot of that in women's studies at Vassar.
I think that's largely true. I think that the reaction against the unhappy 50s housewife that Betty Friedan named led to a sort of swing in the opposite direction, and that there's been some movement around that. But I think the other part of your question really is the intransigence of institutions. Not so much the ideology of feminism. I would add a sociological
totally, and I don't mean to say it's only
no,
feminism's
of course
fault.
not.
Yeah, okay.
But I would say, like, look elsewhere. Look elsewhere for a model of how it might be done. for example, in all of of the EU right now, all of it is now beginning to follow the model that was initially established in the Nordic countries, in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark particularly initially, which is to say, we in the United States, we proclaim family values, but then we tell families to do it all on their own. We give them no support at all. No structural support. Well, look at what happens in places that are, that are, at the same economic level as that we're at, advanced industrial countries, where they say we're going to put the resources of the state in the service of families. That's how much we value families. So, for example, paid parental leave is a norm throughout the EU. The EU as a whole is now going to adopt what they call use or lose policies for men. That is, new fathers can take them, and they can't give them those months to their wives. Those are the daddy days. And if you were to walk into a playground on any given weekday in Stockholm or Copenhagen or Oslo, you would see just as many men with their babies as we would women. That's what paid parental leave does. That's by the government. The government provides, as they do, for example, in France. I mean, when I went to Paris to do my dissertation research, every 3 blocks there was an école maternelle, and I kept thinking, what are these things? Like they're teaching people how to become moms? No, it's state-supported childcare. Right? We have nothing of the kind. Of flexible working hours, so that for better and worse, the majority of women in the Netherlands work part-time. Right? Good news and bad news, right? Because it's hard if you're a part-time worker to get a career advancement trajectory. On the other hand, you have the capacity to balance work and family more readily when your children are young. So what I'm saying is that when states put their resources at the service of families, that to me is what family values ought to look like. And so adopting those kinds of policies at the same time, as sort of revaluing the ability of people to balance work and family without relegating one to sort of an anachronism or something that holds women back. I think that combination is really going to be a valuable one.
So I want to thank you all for joining us, for participating in this wonderful conversation with Rachel and Michael.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.